Hi, this is Matthew, and today I'm going to be talking about a topic that I've done a lot of research for, and that's pretty important to me. Windows 7 support is ended. So after January 14th, 2020, Microsoft is no longer going to be supporting Windows 7, which was a favorite version of Windows for a lot of people. So there are a few people that have held out until the very end and have continued to use it. But a lot of those people were just kind of not wanting to change. They wanted to stick with something familiar, and now they're forced to decide what they're going to do. And of course, they could continue to run Windows 7 in its unsupported state, but I don't recommend that. And for most people, they are looking for options to upgrade. And of course, upgrading to Windows 10 is the option that most people think of. And for my business, I've been helping a lot of people do that. But I also get questions and just people being curious about what are the options. And I like to tell them that, yes, you can upgrade from Windows 7 to Linux. And that is definitely an option. It's a great option. And so which version of Linux is the one that I would most recommend? I've actually spent about a month and a half or 2 months really kicking this around, trying out different Linux distributions, and have come to the conclusion that I am going to be recommending Linux Mint Cinnamon Edition to most people who are upgrading from Windows to Linux. So Linux Mint Cinnamon Edition. And this surprised me because for many years I've been using Ubuntu, and I loved Ubuntu, and I helped a lot of people switch from Microsoft Windows to Ubuntu specifically. But for people who are familiar with Windows and who like some of the things about the layout of Windows or the traditional desktop, the current version of Ubuntu is quite different. It's unfamiliar. It's a little bit hard to get used to. Now, for people who only want to browse the web, it really doesn't matter what operating system version or desktop environment they have, as long as they can see an icon for a web browser like Firefox. They can double click on that, they can get on the web and do what they need to do. So that's not really that big of an issue. But there are reasons why I am now recommending Linux Mint Cinnamon Edition over Ubuntu as far as the version of Linux to switch to. And I'd like to go over those reasons. And one of them is it's going to run a little bit better on older hardware. And so for people who don't want to buy a new computer, they have a computer that works just fine. It's just now Windows 7 is no longer supported. Linux Mint Cinnamon is a great thing to upgrade to from Windows 7. So for a while, I was using and recommending Ubuntu Mate, which is also a lightweight version of Ubuntu. And I liked that, but there are a few limitations and glitches and gotchas, and it is better for people who are perhaps familiar and used to GNOME 2 and likes kind of the classic GNOME Unix Linux feel and wanted to stick with that instead of the newer Ubuntu that's based on GNOME 3. So for some other reasons, which I'm going to get into, that's why I stopped recommending Ubuntu Mate and am now going to be recommending the Cinnamon Edition. Now, for my computer here, I'm actually using the Manjaro Cinnamon Edition for this workstation, but I think that I may be switching my main workstation to Linux Mint. I'm not sure. I also really like some things about Manjaro, but I've switched to the Cinnamon desktop environment, and I'm liking that. Just to kind of let you know that what you're seeing in the background here is Manjaro, which is another version of Linux. But for people who are upgrading directly from Windows or coming from Windows most recently, Linux Mint maybe a little bit easier to get into, and it's definitely what I recommend. So I do have Linux Mint here in a virtual machine. So I'm going to boot, I have it started here. So I'll switch to that. But I just want to mention before I do, here's some of the reasons why I'm recommending it as far as familiarity. The start menu is in the bottom left-hand corner, just like the start menu is on Windows. So that's familiarity. It's easy for people to get used to as far as like, oh, yep, that's where I click on the menu to launch applications. There's good default application choices, ones that I like. So Firefox is the default browser, Thunderbird is installed for email. The default applications, LibreOffice is installed, and then the Mint applications and the X apps applications, I'm really impressed with those choices and how well they integrate with the desktop environment. Familiar keyboard shortcuts. A lot of the keyboard shortcuts that work in Windows also work in Linux Mint, where the new GNOME 3 shell with Ubuntu and other GNOME 3 Linux distributions, some of those keyboard shortcuts don't work the same way. So some familiarity. Obviously, Linux Mint and the Cinnamon desktop environment is not a direct clone of everything Windows. They're not trying to exactly copy Windows. But there's enough that's familiar between the Cinnamon desktop environment and Windows that I think it's a good fit for people who are upgrading from Windows to Linux. It's got an intuitive file manager. It's just easy to browse the files, easy to find things. And then Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu. So the same package manager, apt is used for the package manager as far as from the command line. And applications that can be installed Ubuntu can also be installed on Linux Mint. They share a common base. So even though I'm no longer recommending Ubuntu as a first choice for people to upgrade to from Windows to Linux, Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu, and I still think that it's a great base to build on and to use because it's got great community support. Most applications that are available for Linux have Ubuntu packages. That means that their software can be installed on both Ubuntu and Linux Mint very easily. So I'll switch over here to the little virtual machine that I've got going here with Linux Mint. And I'll just show some of those things. It's got a great welcome guide. It launches when you first start up. I'm using right now that was recently released, the Linux Mint 19.3 Cinnamon 64-bit edition. They do have the 32-bit edition, and that does work. I've loaded on some 32-bit machines, and that's something that's good to know too. Even though I'm into retro hardware, almost all of the retro things that I use are still 64-bit. So kind of the sweet spot that I work with as far as hardware and on kind of my classic desktops or retro desktops are things that sold kind of from the Windows XP era, Windows Vista era, and then the beginning of the Windows 7 era. So kind of in between 2006 to 2012, that kind of 6 years are often what I will focus on for the hardware that I choose to experiment, to play with, to promote. I like that era of hardware, 2006 to 2012. So almost all of the machines from that era are going to have 64-bit processors, even if the operating systems that they originally shipped with that were installed when they were sold new might have been 32-bit. For example, there was a whole lot of Core 2 Duo processors that were 64-bit, but sold with Windows XP, which is a 32-bit operating system. So Linux Mint comes with both 32-bit and 64-bit options, very easy to download from their website. And I usually torrent them so that I can share that bandwidth and then let that other people grab that from me as well with the torrent. So like I was saying, the windowing is very intuitive, easy to use. It's got a welcome guide to help you get started with a whole bunch of things. System snapshots is kind of like Windows System Restore. It's got a driver manager if you need some proprietary drivers. It's got the update package manager. It lets you choose the desktop from a kind of a traditional or the modern. I'm really liking the modern, so I'm leaving it there. It's system settings, software manager, firewall. It's got excellent documentation. I've been digging into that and really liking it. It's got a good help system as well and good community forums. So overall, I'm really liking the offerings that Linux Mint has. In the menu, like I had mentioned, it's accessible in the bottom left-hand corner with a mouse click. It's also available when you click the Start key or the Windows key on your keyboard. It's most likely to be if you have kind of a standard keyboard. So I can press the Start key and I can just start typing. So let's say I wanted to get a text editor. So I can start typing text. LibreOffice Writer is installed and text editor is installed as well. So I can click that, and this is actually part of the X apps, which I have really been impressed with. So this is essentially a fork of Pluma, which is the Mate version or Ubuntu Mate version of the text editor that was forked from gedit with the the GNOME 2 technologies. So the GNOME 3 gedit is significantly different. It's got some different features. It takes some things out. So there's some things that I really like about this text editor and the offerings from these X apps, as they're called. So this is the X app editor, perhaps a small and lightweight text editor is what it says. But it's got some really nice options. So on the view, I can see a side pane here to kind of keep some projects going. If I type test text here with a keyboard shortcut of Control Plus, I can make that text a lot larger. On the view, it also has an overview map, which kind of shows me where I am in the document. If I have a whole lot more text here, it would be easier to kind of see that. You can see that kind of pane, and then I can move it up and down and see where I am in the documents. So there's also built-in spell check. So if we wanted to do that, it's got auto spell checking, and so words that are misspelled, it shows with the little wiggly line, and it's got spelling suggestions right there. So lots of really good features that are easy to access with a classic menu. So that's something that on a lot of the newer interfaces, if you're using Mac OS or the new Windows or GNOME 3 with Linux, they take away this classic menu, and that's something that a lot of people that I talk with in my business as a computer repair and sales guy, they like those classic menus. They're happy they're there, and so when they're looking for an alternative, something to upgrade to from Windows 7, they are more comfortable and more familiar with that classic traditional layout that has that menu visible there, where they can see the file menu, the edit, etc. So that's something that's really nice. Also, I mentioned keyboard shortcuts. So in Windows, when I press the Alt and the Space key, it brings up this menu that I can control the window that's in focus. So when I press Escape, I can get out of it, but Alt Space. And then if I press X, it full screens it. If I press that again with X, it brings it back. And then you can kind of see the other shortcuts that are available there. Minimize is N. And the one that I often use a lot is close, which is Alt space and then pressing C. Or you can see you can also use Alt F4. These are common shortcuts, keyboard shortcuts that are the same as they are on Windows, which kind of uses a traditional desktop environment metaphor that a lot of people are used to, and it works. It works really well. So if I want to close this out, I can press Alt Space to bring up that menu. I can press C, and then I can use, here it's prompting me because I have something that I've made changes, but I can just use the keys, the arrow keys there, and then I can select close without saving. And I did that all without touching the mouse. So these classic keyboard shortcuts that are in the traditional desktop metaphor are here, and they work great in the Linux Mint Cinnamon Edition desktop. Firefox is the default web browser. Thunderbird is available as the default email client. And lots of good, they make really good choices. For example, in the newest version, so this 19.3, they've removed GIMP and they have a simpler application called Drawing. That's a lot like what you would be familiar with from Microsoft Paint or Windows Paint. From the good old days of Windows XP or earlier. Drawing is a lot like that, very functional for basic editing tasks and not so overwhelming like GIMP would be. You really have to study and intentionally learn how to use the GIMP image editor, where Drawing is intuitive, works well for simple tasks. And so Linux Mint, I think, has made a good choice by removing that from the default. Of course, installing any software that's in the common repositories is very simple. So if you wanted to install GIMP, that would be quite easy. Exactly, for I can go to the administration here and go to Software Manager. And it's looking at the cache and generating that for a little bit here. Hopefully I'm connected to the internet. There we go. I think it's coming up there. And so it's got a whole bunch of editors picks, but like I mentioned, if I wanted to get the GIMP application for doing more advanced photo editing type of things, I can just click on that, click install, enter my password, and install that software. It's very easy to get additional software, even though it didn't necessarily come pre-installed. So other things, it's got like a photo manager type of a thing. So think of iPhoto or Photos from Mac. Pix is very similar. It helps you organize photo albums and keep all of your images or photos in an organized manner. Simple Scan, you can just use a scanner to scan documents in. Internet, Firefox web browser. Transmission is for torrents, and then it's got an IRC chat channel as well. For Office, the kind of the GNOME calendar, and it works well. I can sync that with my Nextcloud calendar, and then it's got all of the LibreOffice suite. The most used of that, of course, is Writer and Calc. Those are the two that I mostly use for my business, is to write documents and then do some basic spreadsheet tasks. Sound and video, worth mentioning is this video player. They made a change so that this one uses hardware acceleration. So if you've got a graphics chipset, like an AMD graphics chipset, this video player is going to use that, take advantage of that instead of using all CPU. Rhythmbox is a music player, an organizer type of thing, similar to iTunes. If you're familiar with iTunes, then Rhythmbox is very similar to that. And then there's just, to administrate the things, I'll probably go over some of these things in later videos about how to use particular things to administrate your Linux Mint system. There's some preferences to change the look and feel or some of the extra stuff. I really like the defaults. I think that Linux Mint did a great job in choosing just how Linux Mint works out of the box, how it looks, how it feels. The themes, everything, I think, is excellent in its defaults in Linux Mint. But of course, you can get creative and change things to your desire and liking very easily. You can change the background, put on applets, have a whole bunch of different things. So, and then, of course, easy access to the file manager and the menu. And the desktop file manager is very easy to use. It's got this nice side pane on the side here. And I can change it. Here's kind of a places view. You can have it so that you can have a kind of a drop down tree view, and then you can hide the side pane. You can adjust the icon size right there to your liking. It's got just the presets there, so it can show you different ways to view the icons. File manager, it's very similar to what you would expect if you were used to Microsoft Windows. This file manager has a lot of similarities. I would say in a lot of ways it's a whole lot more powerful too. And again, it's got this classic menu right up here on the top. So the options that you may be looking for are not hidden away from you or inaccessible, or you can't change them. Right here, if I want to see the hidden files, I click on View, Show Hidden Files, and there's my hidden files and folders. It's that easy. Where on other file managers and operating systems, doing something like that may be pretty confusing or hard to do, or you might not even know you have the option. Where here, if you were just kind of exploring the menu, you go, oh, View, Show Hidden Files. You can see it there. You can figure out right away that that's what that does. So I'm generally very impressed with the file manager, how it works, the ease of use in the Linux Mint Cinnamon edition. So I have played around with this on my own hardware as well. I've installed it on my kind of classic ThinkPad T420S laptop, and I'm really loving it there. I have very much enjoyed playing around, setting things up, getting a few of the things tweaked, and getting my data kind of installed and moved over and some of my preferences. And I have to say that the Linux Mint Cinnamon desktop experience has been great. I've also installed it on a couple of customers' machines already, and their initial reactions has been good. They've said, a person today who was picking up a laptop that I pre-installed this for, she said, I like how clean it looks, how simple it looks. So there's a lot of power. You can get to all of these options, and it's not hidden away from you, but people's initial reactions is like, oh yeah, I can use that, no problem. So another win, another good point for the Cinnamon desktop environment. So I guess I can go out of the virtual machine here and back to my article. That's really what I wanted to talk about. I've very much enjoyed Linux Mint Cinnamon Edition. I am going to be recommending it strongly to people who are wanting to try Linux for the first time. Certainly, it's going to be my number one recommendation for people who are coming from Windows to Linux. I think that Linux Mint Cinnamon Edition is probably the best choice. And I've spent quite a bit of time researching this, going through, trying different things, testing it out with people who are, and talking with people who are switching from Windows to Linux and getting their feedback. So from my experience, this is a great choice. Now, of course, with Linux, there's lots of options, and that's the great thing. You are definitely free to recommend and try any version of Linux that you'd like. And that's one of the great things about the Linux community, is that there's so many options. Of course, that's one of the challenges as well, is that there's so many options. So from my experience, that's why I do make a recommendation and say, if you're looking to upgrade from Windows, Linux Mint Cinnamon Edition is a great one to try. Thanks for watching. This is Matthew. Bye for now.